My title tonight is Hitler and Masonry, and we will start by looking at a few facts of World War II. I was a child of World War II, too young for military service, but old enough to know what was going on. I was 15 in 1945 when the war ended. As mentioned, I was too young for WW2, but just right for Korea. Some of you perhaps fell in this same age profile. Now, World War II will go down as one of the world's worst times. We will probably never know for sure how many people died due to this conflict. 20 years after the war was over, official estimates were placed at 40 million deaths, with more than half of these deaths being civilians. This calculation covers the years of 1937 through 45, which began with Japan's attack on China. And then 70 years later, this total has changed from 40 million to 55 million because of new information on Soviet deaths and war-related deaths in China, which had not previously been counted. So for the first time in recorded history of warfare, more civilians died during World War II than military personnel. The 55 million total breaks down like this: 20 million military deaths and 35 million civilians. Of course, these figures include both sides of the war, both Allies and Axis members. But please note that these figures are deaths, not casualties, too. So this is a terrible time. Now, for comparison, of the 20 million military deaths, the United States contributed 400,000 of those deaths. 400,000. Now, folks, that's terrible. But when you place it in comparison to 20 million, it's 2%. So the truth of the matter is, we didn't suffer near as much comparatively as some of the other countries of the world. And of course, our civilian deaths were very minimal. So anyway, that has a bearing on later on when I get to why World War II started. When the question is asked, what started World War II in Europe, most historians point all the way back to 1919 and the signing of the Versailles Treaty that officially ended World War I. It was poorly written, too punitive on Germany in certain areas and too weak in others. The League of Nations was to oversee and enforce the terms of the treaty. The U.S. never became a member of the League, and it was ineffective, and enforcement was basically non-existent. The Great Depression had spread to Europe during these years of the 30s, and this made things even worse, particularly in Germany, as inflation was rampant and their economy was in a mess. So Germany, after World War I, was in shambles. No middle class, a few remaining nobility, and everyone else was poor. This created a condition which was ripe for a strong leader who promised to improve their plight and also repay those rats from Britain and France who left them in these circumstances. Of course, we all know who arrived on the scene, and it was Adolf Hitler. As a side note, I just saw this in the paper here just the other day. As a side note, the first week in February of this year, the French and German governments held a big party in celebration. It was called the Franco-German Friendship Pact, celebrating 50 years of peace between the two countries of Germany and France. Previous to this time, listen to this, previous to this time, there had never been a 50-year consecutive year time period in history of the two countries when these two nations had not been in a state of war. Now that was hard for me to believe. But this gives you a perspective of why France was so wanting to punish Germany so badly through the Versailles Treaty, and they got some of them through. Anyway, since Hitler is one of our focus points, let's take a look now at this man and his rise to power. Hitler was born in an Austrian city just across the border from Germany in 1889 of parents of German heritage. He had a troubled childhood. His abusive father died when he was 12 and his mother when he was 18. He had already dropped out of school when he was 16 and he aspired to be an artist. He moved to Vienna, selling some paintings on the street to tourists, and also this is where the idea that he became a paper hanger because of his artist deal. He had something to do with paper hanging. He applied for and was refused entry into the Viennese Academy of Fine Art. It was in Vienna where he developed his intense hatred of Jews. At the beginning of World War I, he enlisted in the Bavarian Army, which was just basically a branch of the German Army. He was wounded as he was involved in an act of valor, was awarded the Iron Cross, and finished the war in a military hospital. He attained the rank of lance corporal, but more important, he liked the military and the power of the uniform. Thereafter, he became involved in politics, using his public speaking ability. During the beer hall push in Munich, Hitler was arrested. During his trial, he actually became a recognizable name to the German public. He served only 9 months of the sentence in prison, but during that time, he wrote the book Mein Kampf, which translates into My Struggle, which in the next few years not only made him famous in Germany, but also quite wealthy. Most people don't mention that in the story of Hitler, but and this royalties that he got off the book helped him come tremendously in being able to part of his other political life later on. Anyway, his political party, which was the National Socialist Party, grew in importance. It was later, of course, called the Nazi Party. In 1933, he ran against von Hindenburg for president and lost. But in an attempt to create harmony, von Hindenburg named him Chancellor, which turned out, of course, to be a big mistake. Von Hindenburg died the next year, 1934, and Hitler then strong-armed himself into the top position. He was 45 years old. Shortly thereafter, Germany resigned from the League of Nations, which was illegal, politically scrapped the Versailles Treaty, which was illegal by the treaty, and no one, France or Britain or anybody else, took any action. Thus he realized that because those two countries had lost so many men in World War I, like we mentioned a minute ago, that the governments of each could not get their people to agree to do anything that it might ignite another war. When Hitler's actions did not bring on the resistance that he really had expected, he knew that he had them right where he wanted them. Thus, he continued building his war machine, putting more money into circulation, which helped employment, which in turn created an improved economy for the common man in Germany. During this time, his propaganda machine was going full force. The German people knew he was doing some of these things that were not right, but they were better off than they had been in a long time, and thus they turned their backs on the killing of Jews and the closing of churches and so forth. Also, by this time, the Gestapo had taken over and there was a fear factor involved. This set the stage for World War II. This is a very brief look at how Hitler was able to take over a nation that was still bitter from the results of World War I and now was ready to show its strength to the world. It was unfortunate for the world, including Germany, because a madman was at the controls. We will now take a look at the pre-war days of the United States. The United States was suffering from the strong grasp of the Great Depression in 1934 when Hitler took over in Germany. FDR had finished his first full year as president, and his direct governmental help had not really reached the common man yet, the grassroots area. Not only our economy was in bad shape, but our military was almost non-existent. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, which was 5 years later after this 34 date I mentioned, which is the date most people consider as the actual beginning of warfare in World War II, at least in Europe. The U.S. Army, listen to these figures, the U.S. Army ranked 17th among the armies of the world, just behind Romania. 17th in the world. Now these figures were based on the number of men in uniform and their equipment. So perhaps more scary than that was our professional officer staff, by and large, were overweight and incompetent. Perhaps the worst condition was that which was similar to Europe that I just explained. There was a mental unreadiness for war among the rank and file population of this country. Therefore, it is an absolute miracle, helped immensely, I might say, by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, that this nation could convert this terrible state of military unpreparedness into the greatest force known in the modern world, and then change the general population into a mentally tough people in a period of 5 years. You know, hindsight is wonderful. It'd be great to have. Wouldn't it have been great if the Congress and President would have recognized this threat by Hitler and begun to prepare for war here in the United States during the 30s? This would not only have improved this nation's economy, which was going through the Great Depression, and put in a much greater position, it would have put us in a much greater position to combat the Axis war machine. And I suspect it would not have changed Hitler, but I do think that it would have eliminated war with Japan, at least for a while. Now we've discussed the horrors of war, how and why it began, a brief look at Hitler, and then the bad state of affairs in the United States during the 30s. I hope that I've set the groundwork for understanding what happened to the Masonic fraternity in Europe during these times. So now let's get started with the main storyline. Basic Masonry was well established in all of Europe long before World War II. However, I was surprised to learn this, that it was not until February of 1930, that the Scottish Rite was established in Germany. Now, it may have been established a long time ago, and maybe World War I, they ended and never began again or something. But anyway, in 1934, when Hitler took over, the Scottish Rite was only 4 years old in Germany. This Scottish Rite organization, only 4 years old, was not officially recognized by either the northern or the southern jurisdictions in the United States. So, but after Hitler took over, the Grand Commander of this new Supreme Council in Germany was arrested and taken to Sonnenberg concentration camp. Feeling completely helpless, he appealed to Commander Crowl in the United States for help, whom he had met earlier. And primarily, because of a letter written by Crowl, he was released, amazingly. However, he died shortly thereafter because of the ordeal he suffered in the concentration camp. Now, as mentioned, and in contrast to the Scottish Rite, basic Masonry was well entrenched in German society. It was harshly dealt with, to say the least, as the same as the organized churches and any other organization whose concepts and beliefs were not in line with the Nazi culture. Many of the Masonic lodges had huge buildings that would rival in size and beauty our Scottish Rite temples in the United States. Hitler's Gestapo would seize the buildings, find their membership rolls, and then hunt down and jail these Masons, just as he was doing for Jews. Most people don't realize that. Many of the beautiful buildings were converted into museums where the Masonic regalia, books, and equipment were put on display for the purpose of ridicule. To poison the minds of German citizens against Masonry, Masons were accused of all sorts of things like wizardry, witchcraft, and all types of cultic rituals. One of the main charges was that Masonry in Germany was dominated by Jews. The truth of the matter, the majority of the lodges and grand lodges in Germany were 100% Christian. For instance, the lodge called the Prussian Lodges had 57,000 members and not one Jew. Now, there was another group of lodges called the liberal or humanistic lodges, which were in the minority, but they did not disallow Jews. However, the Jewish membership was quite small. So his charge that Jews dominated Masonry in Germany was definitely not true. Hitler's propaganda machine would tell outlandish lies and keep repeating them until the people finally believed it. Along this line, trying to tie Masonry together with the Jews, they cited the old storyline of anti-Masonic generations of the past, that Jews and Freemasons were conspiring to seize control of the world. So during the 1930s, before actual warfare began in 1939, Hitler had all but eliminated Masonry, both the fledgling Scottish Rite and the well-entrenched Blue Lodges, from the country of Germany. As Hitler's juggernaut moved into France and then on to Paris, the pattern remained consistent. That is, the systematic elimination of anything Masonic. All Masonic buildings were confiscated, and in Paris, they were turned into so-called museums, same as in Germany, where they became Masonic propaganda outlets. I had some handouts here, and I forgot to bring them, that had some of these things that showed what they were doing. Signs were posted saying, "Come in and see who your real enemies are, the Masons." Others said, "Come in and see Satan's ugly mimics and their disgraceful ceremonies performed by a handful of miserable who pretend to save humanity and improve mankind." Upon invading the Netherlands in May of '40, the continued destruction of all things Masonic took place. The Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the Netherlands and the Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite were sent to concentration camps and eventually killed. Masonic bodies were dissolved, their funds and property, the equivalent to over $1 million, were impounded. Masons were publicly beaten, and some committed suicide. When Norway fell, a Norwegian by the name of Quisling was installed as the puppet head of the government. His name is often interchanged with the word spy or traitor, and the people of Norway hated him. He established his office in the confiscated Grand Lodge's Masonic Temple, which was a beautiful building in Oslo. Part of the building, which was not used by him and his government, was trashed. At the end of the war, when Quisling was tried and convicted, The court proceedings were appropriately held in this same building. And as a side note, by 1950, all Masonic buildings had been restored or rebuilt, and Masonry was back in Norway, one of the first nations to really get back in good order. Yugoslavia, prior to World War II, was supportive of Freemasonry, but required them to register with the government and take an oath to not engage in any political or revolutionary activities. This, of course, changed when Hitler and his boys took over. Lists of Masonic members were widely distributed, and they were to be treated with contempt by the population. However, some were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered. Two world-famous university professors who also were outstanding Masons were executed in public. And so it went throughout Europe. Masonry and Hitler's Nazi regime were incompatible. Their goals and ideals were complete opposites. Hitler opposed churches, freedom of religion, freedom of thought, the dignity of man, and thus he and Masonry could not coexist. From 1934 to 1945, during Hitler's regime, he had the upper hand, and Masonry in his occupied lands was eliminated. As I mentioned in previous talk, John Henry Coles, the Grand Commander in the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, was an avowed bachelor, and one of his few hobbies was world travel. In the pre-war years, he had traveled to many of the European cities where he was always properly received by the Masonic officials. Consequently, he had met not only leaders, but also Masons in general in these countries overrun by Hitler, or were or at least are in the path of the German war machine. He received literally hundreds of requests for help, some through regular Scottish Rite channels, and some just from personal letters from friends. The Supreme Council responded. One of the first actions was to help organize and then fund to the amount of $36,000 a European Masonic Relief Fund agency through which we could help in the future. One of the principal usages of this agency was to help endangered Masons to escape into neutral countries. This was strictly a beginning. From that initial help from 1930s up to 1943, our Supreme Council had distributed $512,000 toward rescue and relief in the war zones. Now, in the fall of 1943, the Supreme Council voted a staggering amount of $1 million for this cause. This last expenditure was a departure from earlier attempts which were used to help Masons only, and this went to help anybody, regardless of Masonic affiliation. So many people, Masons and others, were saved from sure death by the Underground Railway getting them to safety because of Masonic funds. The British were also helped during the London Blitz. The Supreme Council donated $50,000 to the Old Mother Grand Lodge of England to do with it as they deemed would help the most. During this time in this country, the Supreme Council and many valleys gave liberally to the Red Cross and USO organizations. So, some of you will recall a cigarette named Lucky Strike, whose trademark was dominantly green. Somehow this green dye seemed to be essential for war effort, so they changed colors and then proudly advertised, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." Some of you may remember that. Using this same slogan, one could say, realizing what they had done, Scottish Rite Masonry had gone to war. And so we not only donated the men from our ranks to the cause, but millions of dollars from our treasuries went to help the war effort. Shortly after the end of the war, the Supreme Council's Committee on Foreign Relations, which was chaired, by the way, by the next Grand Commander to be, Thomas J. Harkins, prepared the following summary: the effect of the war on Masonry in Europe. So let me quote just for the next little paragraph here. It was obviously the policy of the Axis powers to suppress Masonic lodges, bodies, and organizations. In some countries, bare traces of the fraternity are left. To the credit of these Masons and to the glory of Freemasonry, there was no voluntary surrender of the rights of the order, no departure from its principles and ideals. It now appears that where a single spark of Masonry still glows, that the few Masons who were left or were allowed to return have promptly engaged themselves in efforts to rebuild the fraternity. From practically every country where Masonry was destroyed, there have come expressions of hope and confidence that the fraternity will rise again and be stronger than ever. End of quote. And this is what happened. Thank you.